The gunshot echoed through the Wyoming wilderness as the Union Pacific locomotive lurched to a violent halt, metal grinding against metal in a symphony of screeching brakes and panicked screams. Inside the passenger car, 2-year-old Emily McKinnon had been crying for exactly 3 hours and 17 minutes when the first masked rider appeared at the window, his face painted with war stripes and eyes burning with a hatred that froze the blood of every soul aboard that cursed train. Thomas McKinnon instinctively pulled his sobbing daughter closer to his chest, feeling her tiny body trembling against his worn flannel shirt while his wife Martha pressed herself against the wooden seat, her knuckles white as winter snow. The other passengers who had spent the better part of the afternoon casting disapproving glances at their crying child were now dead silent, their previous irritation replaced by the kind of primal terror that only comes when death rides alongside you at 30 miles per hour through the middle of nowhere. The autumn of 1887 had been merciless to farming families across Wyoming territory, and the McKinnons were no exception to nature's cruel indifference. Their homestead outside Cheyenne had withered under 3 consecutive years of drought, leaving behind nothing but cracked earth and broken dreams scattered like tumbleweeds across land that once promised prosperity. The bank had taken everything 2 weeks prior, and now they sat on this train bound for Denver with nothing but $23, 3 sets of clothes, and a child who seemed to sense that their world had crumbled around her small existence. Emily's cries had begun the moment the train pulled away from the Cheyenne depot, and despite every effort from her parents, nothing could console her. Martha had tried nursing, singing lullabies her own mother had sung to her decades ago in Missouri, and even walking the aisles while bouncing the child gently in her arms, but Emily's wails only grew more desperate with each passing mile. The other passengers, dressed in their Sunday finest and carrying themselves with the air of people who had never known true hardship, made their displeasure known through sharp looks, exaggerated sighs, and whispered comments about proper child-rearing and public decency. The conductor, a portly man with silver whiskers and a gold pocket watch that he consulted with religious frequency, had approached the McKinnon family twice in the past hour. His suggestions had been delivered with the kind of polite firmness that barely masked his irritation about the disruption to his orderly train car. Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell, the wife of a Denver banker traveling with enough jewelry to feed a family for months, had made particularly cutting remarks about people who should not travel with children they cannot control, her voice carrying just loud enough to ensure everyone within earshot understood her position on the matter. But there was one passenger who had not joined in the collective disapproval, and his presence had been noticed by everyone aboard for reasons that had nothing to do with sympathy for a crying child. Samuel Washington sat in the back corner of the car, occupying the seat closest to the rear door where he could see everything and everyone while remaining as inconspicuous as a 6-foot-tall black man could manage in a car full of white passengers in 1887 Wyoming territory. His weathered hands rested calmly on his knees, and his dark eyes took in every detail of the car and its occupants with the practiced awareness of someone who had learned that survival often depended on knowing which way trouble was coming before it arrived. Samuel was one of the legendary Buffalo Soldiers, a member of the 10th Cavalry Regiment that had spent the better part of 2 decades protecting the frontier and the very railroad lines that now carried him eastward toward an uncertain future. His service record included campaigns against Comanche and Apache warriors, protection duties for survey teams mapping the territories, and countless patrols along the Mexican border where death waited behind every rock formation and canyon wall. The horse soldiers of the 10th had earned their reputation through blood and sacrifice, but that reputation meant little to civilian passengers who saw only the color of his skin and the implicit threat they imagined in his presence. The irony was not lost on Samuel that he rode as a passenger on rails his regiment had helped protect during their construction, surrounded by people who benefited from his service while treating him as though he carried some contagious disease. His military discharge papers and pension certificate were tucked safely in his coat pocket, proof of honorable service that would mean nothing if trouble arose and explanations became necessary. He had learned long ago that being right and being safe were often mutually exclusive propositions for a man of his complexion in this country. When little Emily's cries had first pierced the air 3 hours earlier, Samuel had watched the reactions of his fellow passengers with the detached interest of someone studying human nature in its rawest form. The child was clearly distressed about something beyond normal infant discomfort, and her parents were doing everything they could to soothe her, but compassion was apparently a luxury that required a certain social standing to afford. The whispered conversations had grown increasingly hostile as the miles passed, with some passengers suggesting that the family should be moved to a different car or removed from the train entirely at the next station. Mrs. Hartwell had been particularly vocal in her complaints, declaring that she had paid first-class fare and should not have to endure such disruption during her journey. Her husband, a thin man with nervous eyes who seemed perpetually worried about his wife's approval, had nodded along with her pronouncements while casting apologetic glances toward the McKinnon family. Other passengers had joined in the collective disapproval, creating an atmosphere of barely contained hostility that Samuel recognized from his years on the frontier, where tension could explode into violence with frightening suddenness. The child's distress seemed to be increasing rather than diminishing, and Samuel noticed something that the other passengers had missed in their self-righteous indignation. Emily was not simply crying from tiredness or hunger or even the general discomfort of travel. Her cries had a particular quality that Samuel had heard before, during his years patrolling the borderlands where danger could take many forms and survival depended on reading signs that others missed. The child was afraid, genuinely terrified of something that adults could not see or understand, and her parents' efforts to comfort her were failing because they were addressing symptoms rather than the source of her fear. Samuel had been about to stand and approach the family, his instincts telling him that something was wrong beyond the obvious, when the first gunshot cracked through the afternoon air like thunder. The locomotive's emergency brakes engaged with a grinding shriek of metal on metal, throwing passengers forward in their seats and sending Mrs. Hartwell's jewelry case tumbling to the floor where it burst open, scattering diamonds and emeralds across the wooden planks like fallen stars. The train shuddered to a complete stop with a final, bone-jarring lurch that left everyone momentarily stunned into silence. Even Emily's cries ceased for a moment, as though she too understood that something far more dangerous than her unnamed fears had just entered their world. Through the windows, passengers could see riders approaching on both sides of the track, their faces covered with bandanas and war paint, their rifles gleaming in the late afternoon sunlight that slanted through the Wyoming sky like golden bars across a vast prison. Samuel was already moving before the other passengers had fully comprehended what was happening, his military training overriding everything else as he assessed the situation with professional efficiency. 6 riders, possibly more hidden beyond the curve in the track ahead. Armed with repeating rifles and positioned to create crossfire if anyone attempted to flee. The locomotive had been stopped at a carefully chosen location where the track curved through a narrow pass between 2 rocky outcroppings, eliminating any possibility of backing up or going around the obstruction they had undoubtedly placed on the rails. This was not a spontaneous crime of opportunity but a carefully planned military-style operation executed by men who understood tactics and terrain. Samuel recognized the precision of their positioning and the calculated timing of their attack, elements that spoke of experience and possibly military training among the gang members. The war paint was an interesting touch, designed to intimidate and confuse rather than disguise, suggesting these were not typical train robbers but something more dangerous and unpredictable. The gang leader rode up to the passenger car windows, his face a horrifying mask of black and red paint that transformed his features into something demonic in the slanted afternoon light. His voice carried clearly through the glass as he shouted orders in a mixture of English and what sounded like Apache, though Samuel's experience with tribal languages made him suspect it was theatrical rather than authentic. The performance was designed to terrorize the passengers into compliance, and judging by the gasps and whimpers echoing through the car, the strategy was working perfectly. Mrs. Hartwell had gone pale as fresh snow, her earlier complaints about crying children now seeming petty and ridiculous in the face of immediate mortal danger. Her husband was fumbling with his coat pockets, presumably trying to hide his wallet and pocket watch before the robbers boarded. Other passengers were following suit, attempting to conceal valuables while trying not to draw attention to their movements. The conductor had disappeared, presumably fled to another car or hidden somewhere in the locomotive, leaving the passengers to face whatever came next without official protection or guidance. Thomas McKinnon was whispering urgently to his wife while keeping Emily pressed tightly against his chest, the child's earlier cries now replaced by an eerie quiet that seemed more ominous than her previous distress. Martha's eyes were wide with terror as she clutched her husband's free arm, both of them undoubtedly thinking about their daughter's safety above all else. They had lost everything material they owned, but Emily represented their future and their hope, and Samuel could see in their faces the desperate calculations that parents make when their children are threatened. The sound of boots on the platform outside the car announced that the robbery was moving to its next phase, and Samuel made his decision. Years of frontier service had taught him that survival often depended on acting while others hesitated, and he had seen enough violence to know that train robberies rarely ended well for passengers, especially when children were involved. These men had not gone to this much trouble for the modest contents of passenger pockets and purses. They were after something specific, something valuable enough to justify the risk of attacking a Union Pacific train in broad daylight. As the first masked figure appeared at the rear door of the car, Samuel noticed something that chilled his blood more than the sight of drawn weapons or painted faces. The man's eyes were focused not on the adult passengers and their potential valuables, but on little Emily McKinnon, still clutched in her father's protective embrace. There was something predatory in that gaze, something that spoke of plans more sinister than simple robbery, and Samuel realized with horrible clarity why the child had been crying for 3 hours straight. The masked robber stepped into the passenger car with the casual confidence of a man who had done this before, his spurs jingling against the wooden floor like death bells announcing the final act of some terrible play. Samuel watched as the man's eyes swept across the terrified passengers before settling once again on Emily McKinnon, and in that moment, every instinct honed by years of cavalry service screamed that this was no ordinary train robbery. The child had stopped crying completely now, her small body rigid with a fear so profound that it seemed to emanate from her very soul, and Samuel understood with crystal clarity that she had been sensing this approaching danger for hours before any adult had recognized the threat. The robber's painted face split into a grin that revealed teeth stained brown with tobacco and neglect as he approached the McKinnon family with deliberate slowness, savoring their terror like a fine whiskey. Thomas tightened his protective grip on Emily while Martha pressed herself against the window, both parents' faces reflecting the helpless desperation of people who knew they were about to lose everything that mattered to them. The other passengers had become invisible in their own fear, shrinking into their seats as though they could disappear entirely if they just made themselves small enough to escape notice. Well, the robber drawled in a voice that carried the accent of someone educated enough to know better but twisted enough not to care. Looks like we got ourselves a real pretty little family here. That there's a mighty fine-looking child you got, mister. Mighty fine indeed. His words dripped with implications that made Samuel's blood run cold, and he recognized the tone from his darkest memories of frontier towns where certain kinds of evil flourished in the shadows beyond the reach of law and decency. Samuel had encountered men like this during his service years, predators who used the chaos of the frontier to indulge appetites that civilized society would never tolerate. They operated in the spaces between settlements, preying on isolated families and vulnerable travelers who had no protection and no recourse. The painted face and theatrical robbery were just window dressing for something far more sinister, and Samuel realized that Emily's hours of inconsolable crying had been her instinctive response to sensing the approach of genuine monsters. The robber reached toward Emily with one grimy hand while keeping his pistol trained on Thomas with the other, and that simple gesture broke something fundamental inside Samuel Washington. In that instant, he was no longer just a discharged cavalry soldier trying to make his way in an indifferent world, but a protector sworn to defend the innocent regardless of the personal cost. His years of service had taught him that some lines could never be crossed, some evils could never be tolerated, and some moments demanded action regardless of the consequences to oneself. Without conscious thought, Samuel rose from his seat and stepped into the aisle, his movement drawing every eye in the car including those of the robber, whose painted face registered surprise followed immediately by contempt. The other passengers gasped audibly at the sight of a black man standing up to armed white criminals, their shock reflecting the social impossibility of what they were witnessing. In 1887 Wyoming Territory, such behavior was not just unexpected but literally unimaginable to most people, a violation of every understood rule about race and place and proper behavior. "Leave the family alone," Samuel said in a voice that carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed under fire. His words cut through the stifled atmosphere of the passenger car like a cavalry saber, clear and sharp and absolutely uncompromising. "Take what you want from the rest of us, but the child stays with her parents. That's not negotiable." The simple declarative statements carried weight that surprised even Samuel himself, but he had crossed a line from which there could be no retreat. The robber's face contorted with rage and disbelief as he processed the unprecedented sight of a black man issuing orders to armed white men. His grip tightened on both his pistol and Emily's dress as he snarled, "You uppity boy better sit yourself back down before I put a bullet in your skull. This ain't none of your concern, and your kind don't get to tell white men what to do, not now, not ever." The venom in his voice reflected not just personal hatred but the collective fury of men who saw their assumed superiority being challenged in the most fundamental way possible. Samuel took another step forward, closing the distance between himself and the armed robber with the steady advance of someone who had charged enemy positions under heavy fire and lived to tell about it. His hands remained visible and empty, but every line of his body communicated the readiness to explode into violence at the first opportunity. "My kind," he said with deadly calm, "includes United States cavalry soldiers who've been protecting people like you from Comanche war parties while you were hiding in whatever hole spawned you. And my kind includes men who know the difference between robbery and something a lot worse." The confrontation had escalated beyond simple crime into something that challenged the very foundations of how society was supposed to work in the American West of 1887. Mrs. Hartwell was staring in open-mouthed amazement at the sight of a black man facing down white criminals on behalf of a white family, her previous complaints about crying children now revealed as petty concerns in the face of genuine heroism. The other passengers were witnessing something that violated every assumption they had ever held about race and courage and who could be expected to stand up when standing up mattered most. The robber's finger tightened on the trigger of his pistol as he prepared to eliminate this unexpected challenge to his authority, but Samuel had already seen the telltale signs of an inexperienced shooter about to fire under pressure. His cavalry training took over completely as he dove forward, tackling the robber around the waist and driving both of them to the floor of the passenger car in a tangle of limbs and curses. Emily flew from the robber's grasp back into her father's protective arms as the two men rolled across the wooden planks, fighting desperately for control of the weapon that would determine who lived and who died in the next few seconds. The gunshot that followed seemed to echo forever in the confined space of the passenger car, a sound so loud and final that it left everyone's ears ringing with temporary deafness. Smoke from the black powder charge filled the air with an acrid cloud that burned everyone's eyes and throats, making it impossible to see immediately who had been hit and who had survived the struggle. When the smoke finally began to clear, Samuel was on top of the robber, the pistol now firmly in his own hands, while his opponent lay motionless beneath him with blood spreading slowly across his painted chest. But the victory came at a terrible cost that Samuel understood even as the other passengers began to realize what his actions meant for his own survival. He had just killed a white man in defense of a white family, an act that would be seen as unforgivable regardless of the circumstances or the justification. The legal system of 1887 would not recognize his right to defend innocent people if doing so required violence against white criminals, and every person in that passenger car knew that Samuel Washington had just signed his own death warrant as surely as if he had put the rope around his own neck. The sound of boots running along the outside of the train announced that the other robbers had heard the gunshot and were coming to investigate, their shouts and curses growing louder as they approached the passenger car. Samuel looked around at the faces staring back at him, seeing fear and gratitude and amazement all mixed together in expressions that reflected the complexity of what had just occurred. He had perhaps 30 seconds before the rest of the gang arrived to find their companion dead at the hands of a black man, and those 30 seconds would determine whether his sacrifice had any meaning beyond his own inevitable destruction. Thomas McKinnon was the first to find his voice, his words tumbling out in a rush of emotion and desperation. "We have to help him," he said to the other passengers, his arms still wrapped protectively around Emily who had finally stopped trembling. "This man just saved my daughter's life, probably all our lives. We can't just let them kill him for doing what any decent person should have done." His plea hung in the air like a challenge to everything the other passengers thought they knew about their world and their place in it. Mrs. Hartwell, who had spent the previous 3 hours complaining about a crying child, was staring at Samuel with something approaching reverence as she processed what she had witnessed. "He's right," she said in a voice barely above a whisper. "That man is a hero, and we're all alive because he was willing to risk everything when the rest of us were too frightened to move. We have to do something." Her transformation from complaining passenger to moral advocate seemed to surprise even herself, but the extremity of the situation had stripped away all pretense and social positioning. Samuel shook his head as he checked the robber's pistol and found it still had 5 rounds remaining. "You folks need to get down on the floor and stay there," he said with the calm efficiency of someone accustomed to life-and-death situations. "When those men come through that door, they're going to be looking for me, and you don't want to be anywhere near this fight. Take care of the child and let me worry about the rest of it." He moved toward the rear of the car, positioning himself where he would have the best possible angle when the inevitable confrontation began. But as the footsteps of the approaching robbers grew louder and Samuel prepared for what would almost certainly be his final battle, something unprecedented began to happen among the passengers. Thomas McKinnon gently handed Emily to his wife and picked up the dead robber's rifle, checking to see if it was loaded. The conductor, who had been cowering behind a seat since the attack began, emerged with a small derringer that he kept for emergencies. Even Mrs. Hartwell's nervous husband produced a pocket pistol that he had been carrying for protection during their journey. The passengers were making a choice that defied every social convention and expectation of their time and place, choosing to stand with a black man against white criminals because they recognized that courage and decency transcended the artificial boundaries that society had constructed. They were about to risk their own lives to protect someone who had already risked everything to protect them, creating a moment of genuine human solidarity that would have been literally unimaginable to anyone who had not witnessed the events that led up to it. As the robbers reached the passenger car door, Samuel looked back at the people who had chosen to stand with him and felt something he had not experienced since his discharge from the cavalry, the knowledge that he was not alone in his fight against the darkness that threatened to consume everything decent in the world. Little Emily McKinnon had stopped crying completely now, her young face peaceful for the first time in hours, as though she sensed that the danger she had been feeling was finally being confronted by people who refused to let evil triumph through their own inaction. The door exploded inward as the remaining robbers burst into the passenger car, their faces twisted with rage and bloodlust as they discovered their dead companion and the unprecedented sight of armed passengers preparing to fight back. What followed would be remembered for decades as the day that ordinary people found extraordinary courage, and a black cavalry soldier proved that heroism recognizes no boundaries of race or circumstance when innocent lives hang in the balance.